What's up, everybody? Welcome in to the Big City Sports Podcast. Coming up with another episode, and we're diving into the NBA playoffs. And, of course, we're talking Knicks, Nets today. Going to get into the Islanders series a little bit, and also something that has taken place with the fans in our game of basketball, and basically everywhere, but especially in the NBA playoffs. Before we get into all that, Swig, how you doing today?
Pretty well, my guy. I'm excited to get back into the playoff talk a little bit. I was able to enjoy having a 3-day weekend here. You get a couple of extra things done. Happy about that. But time to get back to business here a little bit. How was yours?
It was all right. Beginning a fitness journey, so hopefully that ends up working out. Or if it doesn't, then you'll still see me plump here on the screen. But until then, we'll figure out what happens that. But let's dive into the New York Knicks. And the New York Knicks are a team that finally made the playoffs. We talked about them a lot this year. Great regular season. But it feels like there's just a lack of experience on this team when it comes to the playoffs. And especially it's showing right now. Julius Randle, he was one thing that stood out to me was he's this top isolation ball guy. He likes to drive in. He plays a lot of ISO ball. But you can tell in the playoffs that really doesn't work unless you're a superstar like a James Harden or a Kevin Durant. What have you seen out of this Knicks team in the playoffs?
I've seen Derrick Rose and a bunch of guys who suck for the most part. I kind of had a feeling this was coming, but we kind of talked about at the beginning of the season how the Knicks might improve defensively, but how they might have a lack of scoring and shooting. And while that wasn't really the case for most of the regular season, it's finally starting to show up now with the teams like the Hawks who don't really try playing defense most of the year. Now they're going to try. You see a team that has a lot of depth and scoring and shooting options, that has that firepower that the Knicks just don't have. And while Derrick Rose has tried admirably to keep the Knicks close in these games, and I'm absolving him of any blame, with Randle struggling, with the Hawks sending multiple defenders at him, with him being less likely to get to his spots, with Clint Capella dominating the paint, with RJ Barrett not doing anything, the Knicks aren't going to win with Derrick Rose being the only productive scorer. It's just not going to happen. So like I said last week, I refuse to let myself get too upset here. I didn't have high expectations going into the series, but it is disappointing. The defense from the Knicks has been a little inconsistent. The offense has just mostly been gone, and that's a pretty bad recipe for winning a playoff series.
Yeah, it is, and they've been so good defensively in the regular season, and it's hard to gauge right here because you're going up against an Atlanta Hawks team that can really shoot the basketball, and they have shooters outside galore, whether it's Bogdanovich or basically anybody on that team. Trae Young's definitely done a great job of doing his thing. That's just being a pest on the basketball court, but still hitting big shots. So, I mean, there's a lot of shooting on this team, and you briefly mentioned that you hoped, not necessarily hoped, you think Frank Ntilikina was going to start seeing some minutes and guarding a little bit. It seemed like Tom Thibodeau's trust in him has backfired a little bit. What do you think about that?
He's been put in very odd moments here and there. Put in for one possession at the end of the first half in game one, which worked, and then at the end of the fourth quarter, which didn't, and then he didn't play again until game four, again in similar short minutes. It's weird. Like I do like his defense, but putting him in cold at the end of a tie game is it's a lot to ask of the guy. I expect to see a little bit more experimentation with the lineups in game five. The end of game four, we finally saw the Knicks try small ball a little bit with Randle and Obi Toppin both on the court, basically for the first time this season. They were on the court at the same time, maybe 12 minutes during the regular season. I'm not even exaggerating. I kind of like what I've seen from Toppin in his limited minutes. He's gotten better at the end of the season, but the guys that the Knicks have relied upon for both primary and secondary scoring outside of Rose have just not really been there. We haven't seen really much of anything from Barrett. Alec Burks hasn't been much of a factor other than in the game two win. And I guess he was pretty good in keeping the Knicks around in game one, but he's been much quieter the last couple games. Reggie Bullock went scoreless in one of the games in Atlanta. I forget which one. Yeah, he's been the primary defender on Young and hasn't had a lot of success. It's just, Emmanuel Quickly's been a non-factor outside the first game. So if with Randle struggling, he's still the engine of the team, and the Knicks are only going to go as far as he can take them. And unfortunately, in this series, it hasn't been very far.
Alec Burks 4 of 13 shooting there on May 30th in game 4. And that's definitely not what you expect or something that you'd hope out of him, because when he's hot, he can still at least boost your offense and get you some momentum and give you some spurts. Now, this is going back to the Madison Square Gardens here. Before this episode drops, there's going to be another game played. How do you feel that that's going to make an impact? Do you think that it gives them any more fire, or do you think that the series is over?
I mean, they might win game 5 at home. I've seen that before. If this goes any further than game 6, I'd be shocked. As soon as they lost home court in the first game, I thought I didn't see this ending well. But it is cool to see both in New York and Atlanta almost full capacities again. It's definitely provided an extra dose of energy to two cities that haven't had a playoff team in several seasons. And they both have younger, more talented teams. But I look at the Hawks as a team that would be eliminated early if this were the NCAA tournament. If you're looking at a team that relies so heavily on their shooting, which the Hawks do, you have one off night in the NCAA tournament, your season's over. And I guarantee the Hawks would have a night like that. They did in game 2, actually. But yeah, in an NBA series where, that one night is not likely to carry over for the rest of the series, you need those multiple scoring options, and it served them very well. And unfortunately, it's definitely been a rough matchup for the Knicks, but the series isn't over yet. We'll see what happens. I did think Randall was a little bit more aggressive, at least in game 4. And I'd like to at least see the Knicks try to go down swinging if that's how this series, if that's the direction this is heading towards. I'd like to see him just, throw everything out there, play as loose and aggressive as possible, and just, fight till the end rather than all the stagnation we've seen in the offense for most of the series.
Yeah, you got to get some sort of production out of that offense, no matter where it comes from. I mean, Derrick Rose, as you mentioned, has been the only one that's really stepped up. Elfrid Payton sort of took a backseat role, and you've seen Derrick Rose take over that starting job there at the point guard position. And it seems like on the Atlanta Hawks side, head coach Nate McMillan has made some adjustments, and he's really guarding the Knicks well and really trying to shut down what's been so successful this year offensively for the Knicks. It's just kudos to him on that side. They're shutting down the offense, and like you said, Derrick Rose is the only one that's really showing up.
Yeah, it's unless playoff Nate pulls what the Maple Leafs did. Yeah, I'm not liking the chances here. In terms of Elfrid Payton, I mean, it's about fucking time he was benched.
Exactly.
I've been yelling at that one for 2 fucking months, dude, if not longer. It's been clear for a long time that Rose and Emmanuel Quickley are superior options, and Payton played 8 ineffective minutes in game 1, and I think 4 or 5 ineffective minutes in game 2. Rose started the second half of that game, and Knicks came back to win that game. Their only win in the series when they were down, I think, 14 at the half. It's just night and day, and the fact that it took this long for him finally to be benched, that's it's still. I still have a couple of questions about Thibodeau. I mean, going back, we saw Keith Bogans get a similar treatment with the Bulls. So there is precedent for this. There's precedent for him having initial success in Chicago and Minnesota and then quickly running those teams into the ground. It took a little bit longer in Chicago. He did an impressively fast job at it. So, obviously, great job so far this season overall. But I do still have some of the same long-term concerns. And in terms of the Hawks throwing the multiple defenders, we've seen a lot. We've seen John Collins at times. We've seen it be DeAndre Hunter, who's had a really, really good series, unfortunately. We've seen even Danilo Gallinari, who I wouldn't say is known for his defense, be effective against him. And you see that second defender coming, and Randall has made some plays, but not to the level we've seen in the regular season. And if that Julius Randle doesn't show up, the series is going to be over.
Yeah, he's got to dig deep and really see, look, this is my team. He knows he's a leader on this team. He needs to realize, look, if I want to be a leader, if I want to go into the playoffs and win in the playoffs, I have to be the one that can steal you a game. Because stars, especially in the NBA, if your star isn't stealing you at least one game in a series, which granted they have won one, then you're not really doing yourself a job. And I think Julius Randle really has to look himself in the mirror and say, I'm the best player on this basketball team. I need to find a way to start making plays and keep our team alive, because if not, we're going to be riding that short bus home.
Well, it's a fine line because he has been the Knicks' best player all season and their biggest scorer and everything. But one of the biggest differentiators from his game the first season to the Knicks to this season has been being willing to make that pass out of a double team instead of forcing something or turning it over as much. So, yes, if he gets a good look, he has that one-on-one, he likes to drive on the baseline, I get it. But if they send 2 defenders at him, find the open guy. And hopefully that guy can hit some shots. I mean, he did that much more effectively in game 4, but for the most part, the assists weren't happening. Alec Burks missed several open shots with the Knicks trying to hang around with the game in that 12 to 15 point deficit. Yeah, if they cut it to 7 or 9, maybe they chip away, but it just never happened. It was a very similar story, I think, in games 3 and 4. Game 4 was still close at halftime, but there was that run at the end of the first half in game 3 and the beginning of the second half in game 4. And it was just watching, it was a deja vu feeling. And it's not just him. It's unfair to put all of the criticism on him, on his very broad shoulders. But it's just, he is also the best player. It's been a little bit tough to watch. I can't lie to you. The the secondary scoring has not really been there either. So I do think that the Knicks have gotten some decent production out of Taj Gibson, pretty much the only other player on the team with playoff experience. But you're going to sense a little 2011 Chicago Bulls theme here, aren't you?
Yeah, that's where I was going to go with my next one real quick is as we keep diving into the Knicks here and what they've been doing so far in the postseason. How much of a factor do you think the lack of playoff experience plays for some of these younger players?
I think it's a factor, but I don't think I'm not going to say it's a primary situation because most of Atlanta doesn't have playoff experience either. They made the playoffs last in 2017, I believe. And a lot of these players weren't even in the league yet. So while they definitely have some experience with Capella and Houston and Gallinari, for example, they're the guys that are having the most success, I'd argue, outside of Capella, Trae Young, Bogdanovich, DeAndre Hunter, none of them have had the playoff experience in the NBA. Yeah, I know DeAndre Hunter had the tournament experience, but most Knicks players had tournament experience. So I don't think that's been the primary factor. It's just I think the Atlanta Hawks much improved defense in this series, being able to contain Randall, and their consistent shooting from the outside has what's gotten them this commanding lead in the series. And I don't think the Knicks, if the Knicks are forced in a game where they need to try to outshoot the Hawks, they will lose. It's not the strength of their team. While they've been a much better three-point shooting team than we anticipated, they do not have that same shooting ability that the Hawks do.
Yeah, if the Knicks want to come back, they got to start finding a way to going back to what's been successful in the regular season, which is smack the floor, put your hands up and start playing some defense, start chesting people and guard them well. And that's what Tom Thibodeau does well. We've said it multiple times on this show. He values defense at a high level. And I mean, you mentioned earlier that it's been inconsistent throughout this series. Atlanta's got shooters. They're going to shoot. You got to go out and contest every single shot that they take. Otherwise, they can do some damage to you. And I want to talk Thibodeau real quick. I see a similarity as a hockey coach to John Tortorella, who sort of goes in and outstays their welcome a little bit, definitely turns around organizations in his process, but it doesn't seem like he really gets them over the hump.
Well, I read something kind of interesting about that because you compare these two teams in the series, and the Hawks were much more aggressive at the trade deadline. I don't know how we haven't mentioned Lou Williams yet. He was a very important key pickup who can also shoot from the outside or mid range. By the way, I read something where Thibodeau wanted the Knicks to go get somebody at the trade deadline. He had Norman Powell in mind, who's actually had a really, really good series in Portland. But the Knicks front office has been like, well, yes, they've thoroughly exceeded expectations this year. Still a building year. They still have a ton of cap space in the offseason. They want to try to keep that future open. So I am curious to see if that leads to any sort of disconnect. Thibodeau is not quite as brash as John Tortorella is. Yeah. Few people are, but we've seen both of them in the New York media market before. And while both of them have had initial success at multiple places, and in Tortorella's case, even won a championship with Tampa Bay back in the day, we have seen that style start to wear on people. They're both very demanding coaches. And while there are a couple guys on the Knicks right now, mostly Rose and Gibson, who have thrived under him in the past and can kind of be the bridge or the mediator in between them and the rest of the roster, that's not necessarily a long-term situation. So I'm really, really curious to see if any relationships start to deteriorate after this season.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's tough because Tom Thibodeau is this well-respected coach around the game of basketball, and a lot of players want to play for him. I think at the very least, a positive outlook into that going into the offseason is, hey, maybe they wanted to free up some of this cap space that they do have and potentially go out and sign a bigger free agent that's available. And maybe that job's more attractive, or that opening's more attractive now that they've made the playoffs. You have a better selling point. And Tom Thibodeau, what he's done in 1 year, that's going to make a free agent go, wow, I can actually come to New York, and they're no longer a laughing stock.
Right, either a free agent or I think another strong possibility is making a trade if somebody becomes disgruntled or becomes clear they're not going to re-sign. There's a lot of options here, and there's no question that this year has been much better, and hopefully it's something they can build off of. Yeah, at the very least, this series wasn't a sweep. There has at least been some competitiveness to it, but I very desperately do not want this season to turn into a fluke. Yeah, it definitely doesn't have to be, but it's going to be a very pivotal offseason coming up. Knicks have the 19th and 21st picks in the draft. They have the financial resources, and they're going to have a couple of open roster spots. And they're also going to have some guys who have been huge all season: Derrick Rose, Reggie Bullock, Alec Burks, Nerlens Noel, who are all going to be free agents. How many of them do they try to bring back? So I know we're looking ahead a little bit here for a series that isn't technically over yet, but it's really impossible to ignore those looming questions.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Hopefully, they can find a way to get back and really start to build something that can end up winning in the postseason. But talking about winning in the postseason, let's head over to the Nets. And the Nets have a team right now that is playing good basketball. I mean, you got your big three all clicking. I think they combined for 108 points the other night. I mean, you got Kevin Durant, you got Kyrie Irving, and you have James Harden all playing great basketball, and that's a great series right now against Boston. I mean, you can assume, or you could have assumed, at least what I did. Okay, let me rephrase this a little bit. You look at what um, I saw Game Three going the way it was. I saw, look, Kyrie's going back to Boston. He's a guy that really likes to think things through and try to play a mental game in his head before he goes out there on the court. And I knew that, okay, things ended sour in Boston. Hey, maybe if I need to score this many points or this is going to happen, and then you try to force feed, and then you don't play your style of ball. So they ended up dropping Game Three, but they came right back in Game Four and really punched Boston in the mouth.
Yeah, they sure did. And I'm honestly a little bit surprised the Nets series is still going on because, well, Boston did win game three on the shoulders of a fantastic performance from Jason Tatum. The Nets did jump out to a big lead early in that game, and then it slowly deteriorated, actually pretty quickly deteriorated. Boston had the lead by the end, either the end of the first or the early second quarter in that game. And while Brooklyn kept it close and I think tied the game with 5 minutes to go, Boston did manage to pull that one out. So kudos to them. They're in a disadvantageous situation here with Jaylen Brown out. And I know the injuries to Kemba Walker and Robert Williams helped contribute to the massive margin of victory in game four. But the Nets should definitely be looking at this as okay, maybe they needed that game to remind them, especially in the hostile environments they're going to be facing later in the playoffs, that it's not going to be a cakewalk despite all of the talent they have. And the Nets do still have some flaws, especially on the defensive end of the court. And occasionally, if their big three is operating at a little bit less than their full Death Star capacity, that the offense can become a little bit stagnant at times. And if that happens with their inconsistent, spotty defense, it can lead to a big run for the other team. And we did see that manifest in game three in Boston. And considering the likely scenario showdown against Milwaukee coming up, it could definitely happen again.
That's fair. I mean, they really looked. But the thing is, when you get to the postseason, it seems like that's when teams start playing defense. Like that's when you're like, okay, we're good enough to where we can win a regular season game. Let's sort of play 70% tonight and see what happens. But once you get to the postseason, it seems like these teams that necessarily or not necessarily have played good defense in the regular season are like, okay, now I got to dial it up. Now I have to turn it up a notch and start playing some defense in the postseason. They did that in game one. Now I know it is a hurt Celtics team, so you can't really gauge what all you're seeing on the floor, but I thought the defense looked light years better to start the playoffs than what they were in the regular season.
No question, and that's part of the reason I think the NBA's instilled the play-in tournament, and they're looking to get the mid-season tournament in next year to try to make the more of the games have that meaning to see better defense. But circling back to the Nets, I do think we need to mention the injury to Jeff Green, who's going to be out for the rest of this series at the very least. And I talked about that being a really solid under the radar signing at the beginning of the year, a guy who can space the floor but has the versatility to guard multiple positions on the defensive end. And because of his absence, we've seen Nick Claxton get a lot more playing time. And while I definitely see some upside with him, there were moments in the series where Tristan Thompson was really dominating him, and I think he had 9 offensive rebounds rebounds in one of the games. So he's a really inexperienced guy on a team with several stars with a lot of playoff experience. There are a couple of weaker links with him off the court. And the other option, if especially with Boston playing small ball, putting DeAndre Jordan in doesn't really feel like the right approach. So I wanted to get this up. I wanted to get an opinion on this from you. One of the games, I forget if it was game 2 or game 3, Boston is going really, really small. And Steve Nash and the Nets respond by bringing in Bruce Brown, who's only 6'4", I believe, kind of playing almost a small ball center role offensively. And he's had success in that role before, and it worked pretty well. Now, do you think that's something that I think it'll help them at least in this series? And we're pretty confident on that unless the apocalypse happens. But how much of a factor do you think that could be against Milwaukee, who's already advanced in the next round, a team with a lot more length?
I think it's definitely interesting. You want to look at something, a 6'4", someone that could play the center. I mean, we talked about a small lineup with Jeff Green at the 5. That was one of our things we talked about in the beginning of the season. That was while Jared Allen was still on the team. We truly believed that they were going to go with Jeff Green at the 5. He spent some time there this year. So I think it's still something that's going to work out. I know he's not the type of player that Jeff Green is. I mean, he's still 6'4", so that's not that big at the center position, but it's definitely something to use as like a curveball if you want to throw from time to time, just sort of get that small ball approach, because you can't send DeAndre Jordan out there for 38, 40 minutes a night. There's no shot that he can handle that workload. So trying to mix it up and keep coaches off balance a little bit, I think it's good as like a change of pace, but I don't think it's something you could try for a long period of time.
It was definitely an interesting move to me. I kind of like seeing a first year coach with the balls, frankly, to do it. And it was effective. But you do see sometimes, especially in a series where they have a series lead, where a coach can be a little bit more timid. And he kind of gave off the vibe, well, I think this could work, but also if it doesn't, we're still going to be experimental here. We know that we have a little bit of room to play with. We know that Boston is vulnerable and that the Nets have 3 superstar players and multiple other effective guys that can space the floor, and that they aren't going to lose this series, even if somebody gets injured. I think we know that. So I definitely respected it. I'm curious to see. I mean, part of the reason the Nets struggled and lost in game 3, outside of the defense struggling, was limited effectiveness from the outside from Joe Harris, Landry Shamet, guys like that. Harris in particular rebounded in game 4, and you can't expect him to have an off night like that very often. He's been lights out all year. And I do think we need to focus specifically on Kyrie Irving for a moment. His return to Boston, he was a little bit off in game 3. It far from terrible. He did it a couple of big threes in the fourth quarter to keep it close, but once that game was out of his system, he bounced back in a big way in game 4 in an absolute annihilation.
Yes, it was. He had 39 points and 11 rebounds in that one. I mean, that's a heck of a performance. And if you can get that out of Kyrie on I'm not going to say nightly basis. I don't think you can do that every night with the big 3 and the scoring that goes around there. But if you can get that sort of production out of him and really let him play his style of basketball, which is run it up the floor and let me do me essentially. And I think you could really start to see that take off for Kyrie. And this could only build momentum going into the Bucks series. So should be a lot of fun. And I'm looking forward to seeing what he can bring to this team.
I mean, we all know what he's capable of. We've seen it in all 3 of his NBA stops. But you're not going to look for him to score 40 every night of the series. You don't look for that. You don't not look for that because he can't. You're not looking for it because the Nets at their best are going to have that scoring be a little bit more balanced, which makes them even more difficult to defend. He is more than capable of putting up a stretch of 40-point games, and so are James Harden and Kevin Durant. But ideally, if they have that team chemistry going and they have the synergy offense flowing, they don't have to, which makes them even more difficult to defend. So Milwaukee was able to breeze through the first round series a lot easier than I anticipated, but they're going to be well rested coming into this series. The Nets have game 5 tomorrow night as we record this. So ideally for them, they'll both have a few days off. But if Boston is able to pull off a surprise and extend this to a game 6, Miami's definitely going to have, at the very least, the energy to start that, or excuse me, Milwaukee's going to have the energy to start the next round.
Yeah, and that was something I wanted to talk about briefly there in the Milwaukee series. We thought Or I mean, you said that you did too. But I thought Miami was going to put up a big fight. I mean, Eric Spoelstra, a lot of people were picking them as like an underdog, a team that could potentially surprise some people. Obviously, with the Bucks struggles in the playoffs, that's why you might assume something like that. Plus, last year, but it seemed like Tyler Harrow disappeared. I mean, he was playing bubble ball, and that's all that he could do. I mean, it seemed like he really fell off the face of the earth, and it was definitely interesting on that series. But looking forward, the Bucks, they're a pretty solid team. And I wanted to ask you a question going back to the big dominant performance of Kyrie Irving in game 4. I think looking at this, how do you feel if someone has a hot hand, if you want them to just go out and drop 40, are you comfortable in doing that? Or would you rather have a balanced offense and sort of spread it around, even if a guy's hot?
I think it's more of a flow of the game type of situation. If one of the guys really does clearly have the hot hand, of course you feed him. But that the guy with the hot hand has to be smart enough where if he starts getting doubled or forcing shots, to make sure to distribute the ball around a little bit, and that'll keep the synergy or the flow of the offense up and avoid those lulls where they can be a little bit stagnant and they're not generating open looks, isolating too often. We saw that a bit in game 3, and I do think we might see it occasionally from the Nets, but I don't think it's a sustainable issue to worry about. The defense, I think, is the much bigger concern as we advance into the playoffs here. In terms of Milwaukee, I am curious to see how the injury to Dante DiVincenzo affects them the rest of the series. We know how important he can be defensively, and it's going to make Bryn Forbes have a much more important role for the Bucks. And they might have a really, really limited bench. So if Brooklyn is able to force the issue a little bit, get some guys into foul trouble, Milwaukee's not going to have too much to turn to off the bench to try to neutralize that. So it's going to put a lot of pressure on the remaining rotation players. But don't want to focus on them too much. Brooke, in terms of should they focus on the balance? Ideally, yes. But if somebody's cooking clearly, then absolutely flow the game situation.
Yeah, I think it's good. Either way, the Nets are in great shape. They should be taking on Milwaukee, we assume. So hopefully that'll be a great series. Someone to watch out for in that series if the Bucks are going to put up a fight. I think just a quick little preview here in case it does happen. Pat Connaughton, he's someone that can shoot the lights out, and if you don't guard him, then I think it could be an underrated factor in that series.
You and your Notre Dame players, huh?
You know, I had to, right?
I mean, yeah, I do the same thing with Syracuse if we could somehow get the Trailblazers into this conversation. But, another time for that. And I know really quick, we want to talk about a couple of fan incidents that have happened in both of these series, as well as the 76ers Wizards series, if you want to introduce that really quick.
Yeah, so we're talking about our fandom here. You with Syracuse, me with Notre Dame. But the fans that have been attending the NBA playoffs have been interesting to say the least. I mean, we've had popcorn, we've had saliva, we've had a lot of different instances, including charging the court. And where I stand on this right now is you got to be better as a fan. I mean, simple as that. You're going to the game, you're finally back, you're finally allowed back into the stadium, and you start acting bogus like this. Come on, look at yourself in the mirror and realize, okay, these are professional athletes. And I know you just want to instigate them to see if anything crazy is going to happen. I'll tell you what's going to happen. Someone's going to give you a Ron Artest 1-2 to the head, and you're going to realize, oh, snap. Wow, they can actually fight back. And it sort of puts the athlete in a tough situation because, I mean, you can't physically, you have to be professional, but you also were like, I can't take this crap. So there has to be some sort of way of annihilating that to where it doesn't happen anymore. It's just a tough scene.
We're all happy to see fans at the stadiums again and have that energy. And I'm sure the fans who have been able to go to these games are excited to be back in the buildings. But there absolutely is a line. Now, I look at the people who say, in Westbrook's case, it was just popcorn or it was just spit. And in Kyrie Irving's case, it was slightly more dangerous with the water bottle being thrown at him, which could cause a little bit more damage theoretically. I don't think if anyone's saying, well, the popcorn being dumped on him or Trae Young being spit on isn't going to physically hurt them, are missing the point entirely. Yeah, you're right. It's not going to physically hurt them, but it's still deeply disrespectful. And more importantly, yeah, I know that we rely on athletes as sports fans for entertainment, but these are still human beings. And I kind of agree with what Russell Westbrook said in the post-game conference after the popcorn was dumped on him, where he said, if somebody does that to me in any other sitting, I'm beating the shit out of him. And I get that. I really do. It's not about being harmful. It's just, I understand why he was upset. If this happened anywhere else, he could have punched him and nothing would have happened. So it does put the athletes in a really dangerous spot. And the Ron Artest situation, even, was that one extreme? Well, yeah, but the fan did instigate him by throwing a cup and a bottle on him, and it's going to piss a normal person off. And in the heat of the moment situation like that, it's going to be really difficult for anybody to show restraint. And that's why you're relying on the security guards to do it for you. In the Knicks case with Trae Young being spit on, look, I fucking hate the guy, but don't fucking spit on him, dude. That's vile. Whoever, I know that all of these fans in question have been banned, but there's a fine line, right? The fuck Trae Young chants. Those are not going to physically hurt anybody. I understand that they aren't the best for 5-year-olds to watch on TV if you have Christian parents, but that type of thing, the energy from the fans, no issues with that at all. And Boston fans booing the shit out of Kyrie Irving, I have no issues with that either. But when things are being thrown at these people, or there's saliva or popcorn involved, that's where it crosses a line. So we're all excited to see the energy, but it has to be contained a little bit.
100% agree with you on that. And let's get into the Islanders real quick. And the Islanders are tied 1-1 in the series after Casey Cizikas won the game on in overtime. And one note on that one that just ended here as we're recording. It just ended literally seconds ago before we hopped into this Islanders. So this is raw take. We all watched the game. Diving in right now with the Islanders. They had outshot Boston in overtime 7-1. So they put up a dominating force there in overtime. And looking at this series, I mean, this is going to be a back and forth, and it's going to be a lot of fun. What do you see?
Well, I see two teams I can't stand playing each other with a berth in the conference finals on the line. So I'm not seeing it quite in the same light that you are. But all jokes aside, I think the Islanders winning the game tonight makes our talk tonight a little bit simpler. We're now going to be able to preview the rest of the series with game 3 not starting until after this episode drops. Basically, we're previewing a best of 5 now. So that makes our jobs a little bit easier in terms of this is still going to be current, which is great. This series, I expect to be incredibly physical. The first game of the series absolutely was. We saw more of that in tonight's game too. And we're also going to see that goaltending advantage that the Islanders had in the first round completely neutralized, if assuming Tuukka Rask stays healthy. Even if he doesn't, they have much better alternate options than the Pittsburgh Penguins did. So I expect to see a much more physical defensive series. And I expect it to be incredibly competitive in the first 2 games. While the Bruins did win game 1 pretty decisively, I expect the series to go at least 6 games. And I think it's going to be a really, really tough ride.
It is. And this Islanders team, I mean, you watched them tonight. And they're in the first period, they got outplayed. It seemed like every single time they were in the neutral zone, it was a turnover, and they couldn't really hold the puck. I mean, Marchand had a couple looks on the outside, just trying to shoot at Varlamov, who I was a little bit surprised to see get the start tonight, or at least to hear in game 2. Did you think that goaltending switch was something that was a great move there by Barry Trotz?
See, actually, yes, I like this one a lot more. Now, we talked off pod just before we started recording about the Vegas Golden Knights switching from Marc-Andre Fleury, who played the first round, to having Robin Lehner start game 1 of the second round. I wasn't a big fan of that move, mostly because of the timing, not because Robin Lehner's incapable. It has nothing to do with that. But in the Islanders' case here, after Sorokin had a less effective game 1 in the second round, where the Bruins as a team kind of dominated the second half of that game, then reinstilling Varlamov for game 2 just to try to change up the energy, slow down the momentum a little bit. I did like that a lot more personally.
Yeah, and the way game 2 went tonight, I mentioned earlier the neutral zone turnovers. There, it seemed like the only way they were scoring goals was the greasy goals, as what who was it that usually says that? Is that Ray Ferraro? You need to get a greasy goal. Need to get a greasy goal where you just put your head down and just got to get in front of the net and start whacking and whacking and whacking, or try to get a deflection, a screen, something that's just not the occasional you got sniped. So that's something that's the way the Islanders played tonight. The way they got their goals. First one was a deflection that Rask looked in and it's like, what the hell's behind me? Oh, it's the puck. So definitely not something that the Bruins are looking forward to, because they're just a gritty team. This Islanders team, Boston the same way though. They play a little gritty style, but the Islanders are they're scrappy when it comes to getting in front of the net. And that's how they score their goals. They're not going to blow it past you. I mean, you have a few snipers on the team, but outside of that, they're going to play that controllable style of play, and then they're going to get in front of the net and try to find a way to score.
Absolutely. We've talked about them not having a ton of dynamic talent. And I want to break down the rosters a little bit here. We're going to treat this more of a preview rather than recapping the first two games, or at least that's how I want to look at it. So, one thing that we can look at is the top six for both of these teams, meaning the top two forward lines. And that, to me, is where the Bruins have their biggest advantage in this series. So while the Islanders absolutely have their moments with guys like Matt Barzal and Jordan Eberle, or that second line of Bailey and Nelson and Beauvillier, that top line for Boston of Marchand and Pastrnak and Bergeron, good luck. You are not going to stop them. You're hoping to slow them down. They are going to get at least some points. They already have in the first couple of games of this series, right? And then the second line, bolstered by Taylor Hall, who was the most predictable bounce back as soon as he was traded in any trade deadline that I could remember, right? He's fit in perfectly on that second line with David Krejci and Craig Smith. And I do think that is an area where the Bruins are clearly at an advantage. And while the Islanders' defense is more than capable of at least slowing them down, it's going to be a really, really tall task for that to last long enough for them to win this series. So I do think Boston has a slight edge overall. I think that's the biggest reason why. We can go position group by position group here in a minute, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't want to do this again, but I am. The New York Islanders, the last time I said the Penguins are going to just run them out of the building. And I don't think Boston's going to run them out of the building, but I think Boston's going to win this series because I think Boston's going to win the Stanley Cup. And they're a legit hockey team. The way that they compete night in and night out. I mean, they're scary. They have grit when they need to have grit. And you mentioned the top line. I'm going to use a line that I just said line again. But anyway, the line that Dan Patrick used to use on SportsCenter. You can't stop them. You can only hope to contain them. And that's exactly what you're trying to do with that top line of Marchand, Pastrnak, and just a ton of great players on that top line. And basically, the way the Boston Bruins play is a style that I think could cause havoc for the New York Islanders, which is they play fast, they get up and go, and they still have a solid enough defense on the back end to where they're not getting burned every time they do activate.
Yeah, but I also think that the Islanders' great defense that we've talked about, especially that top pair, is going to end up being neutralized a little bit because the Bruins' top pair of Charlie McAvoy and Matt Grzelcyk might be better. In fact, I'm going to say it now. I think it is better, especially McAvoy. And that's no disrespect intended. I think these are two of the top 5 defensive pairs in the NHL. But I see McAvoy and Grzelcyk as more likely to slow down the Barzal line than I see Pelech and Polak being able to slow down or shut down more reasonably that Pastrnak, Bergeron, Marchand line. So I do think that's going to play a factor. The Islanders' second and third pairs, that second pair of Leddy and Mayfield, I think primarily is going to get lined up against that line led by Taylor Hall and Krejci and Craig Smith. That's going to be a tough matchup for them. They had a little bit of help in that Penguin series, even when Malkin came back, because he's mostly playing with Jason Zucker. And that line against that pair, Zucker, I don't think was a great fit for the Penguins. And I don't think he had a very good year overall that continued into the playoffs. And then the Islanders also had the good fortune of both goalies being valuable players for them. But it's not going to be quite that simple in this series. Now, on the other hand, I do think the Islanders have the advantage in the bottom 6. Especially that third line with John Gabriel Pageau on it and Wallstrom on it and Palmieri on. I do think that's better than anything the Bruins can bring out in the bottom 6 with the Corrales of the world. No offense intended. But you can't rely on your bottom 6 to win you a series. You might be able to rely on them to win you a game, not a full series. And I think those top players for Boston are better overall than the top players for the Islanders as a group.
I'm a big fan of John Gabriel Pageau. JG Pageau just plays the game well. I mean, he's a great center and he wins faceoffs and he also gets in. He's a great forechecker, and that's what you want on that third line. Someone that just really gets in there and forechecks well and will activate a little bit there offensively and try to keep plays alive. He's someone that could really set up and be a playmaker when he needs to be too. So getting that, also having a goal scorer like Palmieri. I mean, I guess he's getting there in age, but he used to be a goal scorer and he could still turn that on when he wants to. So still nice to have on that line. I think that, to your credit, line 3 is a checking line and all 3 of them do it well to where they can just get up and start forechecking.
No doubt, but I do think that line will only get them so far. I am curious to see how much, if any, if we see of any line shuffles or combinations being altered or anything like that. On defense, I do like, yeah, that's where I do see Boston having a pretty decided advantage. Well, that top pair is debatable, but you look, having Brandon Carlo on the second pair, for example, I do like that. I do trust that a little bit more. I think that Andy Green and Noah Dobson pairing is going to be an interesting one. I think the Bruins are going to try to have their top players on against them as often as possible. It's not going to be easy. See if they can target that in the period of the long change or anything like that. And then really quick with the goalie situation. Now, I still like the Islanders goaltending situation a lot. But as much as I like Sorokin, and I still stand by what I said last week that he's the goalie of the future, I did think Varlamov was going to end up being a factor in this playoffs again. And he had the one rough game in Pittsburgh where it was clear that he wasn't 100%. And Sorokin did play outstanding hockey after that. But considering the lack of his experience, you had a feeling maybe that a rough game was due for him, and nothing against his talent or lack of preparation. But that, considering the great year that Varlamov had, I would have been surprised if he ended up just being on the bench this entire series or until their backs were against the wall, like Spencer Knight in Florida.
That's where you sold me right there at the end. I knew that he had a fantastic season this year, and yeah, what are you going to do when a goalie has a great year? You're just going to keep riding the kid? I don't think so. I think you're going to go back to what got you there, and especially when you drop a game like they did in Game 1, you go back to someone that won you a lot of hockey games, the Semyon Varlamov, who sort of had a resurgence this year and took off as one of the best goaltenders. Now he does have a great defense in front of him, but he's still a great goalie and is someone that stepped up. He stepped up here in Game 2, and he's going to step up later on in the series. I still think Sorokin sees some time in the net later on.
I agree. And it's nothing against Sorokin at all. Now, and if the Islanders were still on the winning streak, then I don't think Varlamov would have come in yet. But once they did drop that game, I think that was the perfect time to say, first of all, it wasn't Sorokin's best game, but also now's a better time in terms of not disrupting that team chemistry to reinstart or
Take notes,
reinstill
DeBoer.
Varlamov into the starters role. So yeah, I'm taking a shot directly at you, Pete DeBoer. I hope you're watching this. But I did think that made a lot more sense, and it worked out in the Islanders' favor in Game 2. And like we said, best of 5 here coming up. I'm curious to see which one can get 3 more wins.
All right. So who are you taking in this series if you had to be held at gunpoint?
Yeah, that's kind of how it feels as a fan of neither of these teams. But I'm picking Bruins at 6 as a prediction. I do think it'll be a really close, hard-fought series, though. What about you?
I'm going Bruins in 7, and then the Bruins will make their way to the Stanley Cup final, as I mentioned, and they're going to win the Stanley Cup. I know that'll probably make you sick, but that's where I stand right now, and I think it's going to happen.
Yeah, I think I'm sticking with my pick from last week. I'm picking the Avalanche to win the cup, and I'm just going to say again, I don't pretend not to be biased on this show. I hope Boston doesn't get that far. I'm hoping whichever team wins this series from hell loses to the winner of the Carolina-Tampa Bay series. That's what I'm hoping for.
I'm fine with that as long as it's not Tampa Bay. I can't stand the Lightning. They dodged their way around that salary cap. It was horrendous.
Well, I got that's an interesting discussion for another day. I know not everyone listening will understand that one, but I do think I don't blame the Lightning for taking advantage of the loophole. I blame the NHL for having that loophole exist in the first place.
That's a good point. And that's going to do it for today. So everybody, I appreciate you tuning in today. We had a lot of fun talking hockey, talking basketball, and getting a little take on the fan incidents that have occurred. But coming up, we're going to get into see if the Islanders are still around. The Nets should still be around. If not, something very, very catastrophic happened. Like you mentioned, was the eclipse. What'd you say?
I can't remember exactly what it was. I think it was the apocalypse. Or
Apocalypse. Like That's what it was. Yeah. So if an apocalypse happens,
eclipse doesn't end the world.
Yeah, eclipse doesn't end the world. I got tested on my knowledge there. But anyway, that's wrapping it up for today. Check us out next week. As I mentioned, we're going to see if the Islanders are still around. The Nets should still be around. So look forward to that. Check us out. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Leave a like, leave a review, 5 stars if you think we earned it. YouTube. Check us out, see our faces, leave a comment there. We'd love to pop up your comment here on the show sometime and see what's going on. But for the Big City Sports Podcast, First Swig, I'm Dylan Kearns. We will see you next time.